experience here. We're going to return specifically to the theme that we started with today, which is democratic backsliding in the Western Hemisphere. As we talked about in the introduction to this experience here, arguably the most urgent problem that the hemisphere faces, and one that we will hear, but I believe firmly that the United States government recognizes and takes quite seriously, including in the agenda for the Summit of the Americas, but in the broader approach to Latin America. A core problem that makes it difficult to solve, and very many other problems that the Summit of the Americas is trying to address, ranging from inadequate infrastructure to corruption to a lack of resilience to climate change and migration, and you name it, all of them much more difficult to solve because of the fragile state of democracy in the hemisphere. I guess maybe I won't speak for the US government, but instead let me start by just asking if the diagnosis that I just gave is shared by you, Madam Undersecretary, and Secretary Blinken and others in the administration.
Well, Ben, I wanted to just say what an honor it is for me to join. And I feel a little bit following President Boric, like a person called Fred Capps, who you may not remember. He was the magician who performed on the Ed Sullivan Show after the Beatles. So I would say, drawing on President Boric's brilliant masterclass presentation and your opening bed, I concur. And I think, the impetus for this 9th Summit of the Americas gathering here in LA, the first time the United States is hosting in over 27 years, is really to bring democracies together to make them more effective, more inclusive, and more adaptive. It's ultimately about democracies delivering for their citizens, but also for this region and ultimately for the world. So to your point, I think we have to, be forthright and clear-eyed about the challenges and the threats facing us, many of which we label 21st century threats, whether it's digital disruption and weaponization of social media to fuel hatred, to erode trust in democracy, but also factors that can literally rot democracy from the inside, namely kleptocracy and corruption. So final point I would underscore here is the whole importance of restoring US multilateral leadership and engagement, again, which is what this summit is about, because we have to tackle these problems together. It's not for one country, certainly not for the United States, to go it alone and try to move forward without the hemisphere alongside us.
Let me ask you a question. Your responsibilities obviously are global. We tend to think of Latin America, or we did, as a region that was distinct from many parts of the world, in that within the region, there was a commitment to democracy as the only permissible political system. And this was a commitment made at many times, but in particular 20 years ago, when the region and then Secretary of State Colin Powell signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter, a historic moment that now seems to belong to another era. And I wonder if you still find this region as one that stands out with a consensus about the political system of democracy as being the only, or at least the far superior version of government at the moment.
I believe that we have a hemispheric-wide commitment to democracy, but I think it's very important that we consider this question not just one for governments to be the arbiters of, but ultimately this is about the people. When President Biden describes the greatest challenge of our time being the contest between democracy and autocracy, it is what I was referring to earlier, this impetus for democracies to deliver. Not to deliver for simply the majority or those who support a government in office, but for all. And I think in the conversation that preceded this one, this whole issue of inclusion, this issue of nonviolent action and social mobilization and the acquisition of social power and participation, these are all underpinned by what we call universal human rights. Freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of conscience. They are not owned by any one region, including this hemisphere. They're universal commitments articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, articulated in the Inter-American Charter, Democratic Charter, celebrating its 20th anniversary just last year. But it's not a static process. When I say we need to be more effective, more inclusive, and more adaptive, I think the adaptive piece is again, one of the galvanizing moments that and opportunities we have with thousands of people coming together in LA from all over the hemisphere for a very specific purpose to contribute to a way forward. How can we build more accountable democratic institutions? How can we preserve the space for civil society actors to operate and to hold their governments to account? How can we protect free and independent media from actors who literally want to criminalize free expression? How do we support champions of human rights and democracy who've been forcibly exiled from their home countries, from their families, simply for doing what's right? So, it is a immense set of challenges, but I think what is captured in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, it is still a way forward, but one in which we need to renew our efforts and look at how we can be more mutually supportive and more effective and more inclusive, frankly, with more actors from beyond government, from marginalized groups, from the private sector, in addition to civil society, being part of this government to government effort.
President Biden in December, I believe, of 2021 held a summit of democracies in order to increase coordination and collaboration amongst democracies in the defense of democracy, acknowledging, I think, that it can't depend only on the United States, acknowledging perhaps that the United States is not always the democratic model that it had been in the past, struggling, like many countries in the region, to sustain its democratic institutions. Looking in the Western Hemisphere, our focus for today, have you found enough partners willing to play this role, willing to be coordinating with the United States and with each other to defend democracy at a time where there are so many challenges that have resulted in, I think, a very inward-looking region?
No, absolutely, Ben. I think we have found that. And, we were proud to welcome 26 different governments from the Western Hemisphere to the Summit for Democracy. It was a summit for democracy, not a summit of democracy. So we had governments, leaders participating alongside virtually hundreds of civil society activists, leaders, private sector champions from around the world. There were three core pillars to the summit effort. One was countering authoritarianism. The second was elevating the fight against corruption. And the third was stepping up to defend human rights at home and abroad. Now, that took place in December of last year. Within a few months, we had the devastating further invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 24th. And I think what we've seen in this hemisphere, particularly in the United Nations, is it's quite striking. We saw the Russians held to account in the General Assembly, in the UN Human Rights Council, which created a commission of inquiry to investigate Russia's grave violations of human rights. And ultimately, we had an overwhelming vote in the General Assembly with many key governments in the region joining the United States, European partners, as well as governments from Asia and Africa, in recognizing that Russia's actions were incompatible with its continued membership on the Human Rights Council. I think some of those actions were perhaps not conceivable in a notion of viewing the world, let's say, in a G77 versus transatlantic mindset, which is not the reality in the world today. Our organization of the Summit for Democracy was inclusive. We had every region of the world represented. We had long-standing well-established democracies alongside emerging ones, with a recognition of common challenges that we face and a common impetus to work together.
I have two more questions for you, and I know you have to get going. The first one is a global one and maybe a challenging one, but it's one I hear in the region a lot, which is the weighing of US values and US interests and attempts to be as consistent as possible in the defense of these values. In the case of democracy in Latin America, many will point to relationships the United States has with authoritarian governments, often very close relationships. Within Latin America, there was an apparent pivot on Venezuela, for example, after a very long period of basing those policies on values, and then a hint that energy considerations might contribute as well to a potential rapprochement. And again, that was quite tentative, and it's not clear the direction of policy. But I just want to ask you more broadly, how the US and how you and your portfolio try to balance those issues, seek consistency while recognizing that in this world, there are authoritarian governments that are partners to the United States.
Right. Well, absolutely. I mean, one, I would say that President Biden has been very clear in instructing us as diplomats, our government as a whole, that we need to work to center human rights and democratic values in our foreign policy. That is an ongoing effort, but it is not an effort to impose democracy on the world, to engage in regime change or seek to impose an outside view. We really want to support champions of universal rights within countries. We want to work with like-minded governments. We want to lean in with allies and partners, many of whom are in this region and play indispensable roles internationally. Argentina is the president of the Human Rights Council, which has taken decisive steps this year, with the US returning to the council to hold Russia and other serious violators of human rights to account. We have an imperative to engage the world. You know, many US partners are not governments that are democratically elected by their citizens, but we can support greater citizen participation. We can support gender equality. We can support inclusion, the rights of persons with disabilities, LGBTQI plus equality, and greater inclusion in solving some of the most grave challenges to all of us, including climate disruption, the global peak in forced displacement with over 100 million displaced worldwide, and Venezuela representing, the second or third largest displacement crisis in the world. It's going to take a collective response. And I think what you're seeing in this administration is a real renewal of American readiness to work multilaterally, to work in a spirit of inclusion, to try to problem solve these issues and at the same time hold ourselves to account with a renewed commitment to strengthening our democracy at home.
You've spoken a lot about the re-engagement with multilateral institutions. You and I have both sung the praises of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, of the commitments that I think are still broadly alive in the Western Hemisphere for the defense of democracy. Yet in our earlier discussions today, there was a lot of skepticism as to whether these tools are adequate. Mm-hmm. And in particular, whether they're up to the challenge of a new form of democratic decline, which is not the traditional coup d'etat, but rather this very slow, murky process of reduction in civil space, and an increase in concentration of power in the presidency, a lack of the balance of power built into the system. You have knowledge of this globally, and you understand the way you're pursuing these policies. Are the tools adequate? Are the tools, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, up to this challenge? If not, do we need new ones? Mm-hmm. Is it a matter of commitment? How do we address this new form of democratic backsliding, which is quite different than the challenges we saw in Latin America in previous eras?
Well, I would say we need to modernize our toolkit, Ben. I think that's very much the assessment of this administration. You know, we have legacy achievements such as the National Endowment of Democracy and their family of organizations created. Actually, we're coming up on the 40th anniversary of President Reagan's Westminster speech. And, so those are very important legacy institutions in our effort. But, what we are contending with today is very different of the world of 1989 and 1991. We need to up our game, and we've elevated the fight against corruption as a core national security priority. We are advancing through the Summit for Democracy effort, and an effort that we label Tech for Democracy, recognizing the incredible promise that technology offers the world in terms of economic growth, advancement, and connecting people, but also the double-edged nature, the degree to which technology has been weaponized or manipulated to drive hate or to strengthen repression. So that's another very important piece of the puzzle. And I think the inclusion issue, we keep coming back to this, but it's not just about equality on paper, it's about equity. We really need more voices at the table. Women, girls, marginalized groups. We had very important questions today from the students about indigenous peoples and their role in Chile's democratic transition. I mean, for too long, it's been too small a circle of elites and leaders making these decisions. And I think that is one of the factors why they fall short. So, the degree to which we can be more inclusive in our own democratic renewal efforts, I think will be ultimately a test of our effectiveness and success.
We wish you luck. Please join me in thanking Secretary Zeya.